I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't an alarm clock that woke me that morning. It was the unholy roar of bulldozers outside my elderly mother's window. By the time I threw on my boots and ran down the porch steps, her home, our family's anchor for 3 generations, was already crumbling under steel jaws and flying dust. My mother stood frozen on the lawn, clutching a shoebox of old photos, watching 60 years of memories vanish into rubble. The HOA president, arms crossed and smirking like a queen on a chessboard, barked to her crew, "Keep going, we've got a parking lot to build." What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that less than 24 hours later, she'd be standing in my courtroom explaining why her little empire thought it could erase a lifetime with the stroke of a gavel. This isn't just a story about a demolished house. It's about justice, revenge, and what happens when the wrong family gets pushed too far. Before we dive in, drop a comment below with your city and what time it is where you're watching. I want to know where my neighbors in this fight for justice are tuning in from. If you want to understand how a house becomes gravel, you've got to know the soil it stood on. Our neighborhood wasn't always a battlefield. It was a quiet patchwork of porches and picket fences stitched along a creek, the kind of place where mailboxes leaned like old men swapping stories, and azaleas had seniority over most of the residents. My mother's home sat at the end of Cottonwood Lane on a small rise that caught the evening light just right, gold pooling on her geraniums, winking off the brass numbers on the door she polished every Saturday. The house was modest paint, a little tired gutters that groaned melodically in the rain, but it had a particular dignity, the kind you don't measure in square feet. Enter the HOA, our neighborhood's self-appointed priesthood of property values. On paper, they kept order, trimmed hedges, quiet hours, pool passes. In practice, they were a clubhouse for the sanctimonious and bored. The president, Victoria Lang, sharp bob, sharper cheekbones, wore a red blazer like a general's uniform and carried a clipboard the way a knight carries a sword. Her inner circle, Todd the treasurer, with a calculator for a conscience. Denise, chair of the Architectural Review Committee, known for pronouncing the word non-compliant with the relish of a food critic discovering truffle, and Pam, a serial emailer who signed off every blast with warmest regards, like a passive-aggressive bow on a brick. They loved a plan. And their latest plan had a glossy brochure, Vision 2030, Modernize Maple Creek. Pages of stock photo sunshine promised walking paths, irrigated medians, a dog park with artful boulders, and a sit-down for this parking expansion by the clubhouse to accommodate community events. The map showed 12 crisp gray rectangles right where 3 older houses sat as stubborn as tree stumps. One of those rectangles wore my mother's address like a chalk outline. At first, the talk was gentle. A letter arrived about opportunities for community enhancement, then a survey with leading questions. How excited would you be to have more space for events, followed by a footnote about potential lot adjustments? I still have the pen they included, as if ink could bias us into surrender. Mom brushed it off. They'll move on to a gazebo by fall, she hummed, one eye on her lemon bars in the oven. She had that World War II nurse grit kindness wrapped around a spine of tempered steel. But subtlety was never a long-term strategy for people addicted to power. The violations started to arrive like postcards from a bad vacation. Unapproved color variation mailbox not matching HOA black. It had faded to charcoal. Shutter misalignment of 0.5 inches. Denise brought a ruler. Non-conforming garden gnome. He wore a tiny fishing hat, for heaven's sake. Each letter crescendoed with fines assessed to your account and deadlines not to exceed 10 days. 10 days to repaint a mailbox. 10 days to train a gnome to comply. I went to the next board meeting, a Wednesday night performance in the clubhouse, where the air smelled like dry erase markers and old coffee. Victoria presided beneath a canvas print of a magnolia the size of a stop sign. When I stood to speak, she smiled the way a cat does at a bird feeder. "My mother is 90, I said. She waters her roses every morning and knows everyone's birthday on this street. Maybe we can work out a reasonable timeline instead of," Sir Victoria cut in, tapping her pen. "Compliance is the grease that keeps a community's gears turning." Todd leaned into his mic. "And failure to comply exposes the HOA to liability. Liability for what I asked." A geranium uprising murmurs bubbled. Denise lifted her ruler. Yes, she brought it to meetings, like a scepter. We measured. The shutters are objectively misaligned. I pressed my lips together until the moment passed. "Look," I continued, "my mother is aging in place. She's protected under state and federal law in certain respects. We can discuss accommodations." That got Victoria's attention. "Law. We apply rules uniformly," she said. "Uniformity preserves value." A hand rose in the back. Mrs. Patterson, 83, voice paper thin. They told me my ramp disrupted elevations. I told them my knees disrupt stairs. Nervous laughter skated across the tile floor. Victoria smiled, wider, thin, and silver. "We have a ramp policy," she said. "We're all about accessibility within guidelines." After the meeting, a cluster of board members huddled around a site plan. I lingered long enough to hear Todd say, "If we clear the corner lots, we can push the drive aisle out 2 more spaces. 2 more spaces." You would have thought they were drafting a peace treaty, not a parking lot. The next morning, a real estate sign appeared. 2 houses down, "We Buy Houses" cash offers, and a flyer sat on Mom's mat. "Consider a generous relocation package." It chirped as if being uprooted were a spa weekend. Mom held it between thumb and forefinger, like it might smear. "They think old means easy," she said, not angry so much as amazed. I tried a different tactic coffee on Victoria's porch, neighbor to neighbor. She served it in mugs that said, "Live, Laugh, Landscape." I thanked her for the meeting. She thanked me for being engaged. We danced. "The parking expansion," I finally said. "Why here?" "Centralization," she replied. "Efficiency. Safety. People need places to park for events. Right now we're non-compliant with fire lane standards." She glanced at my face to see if the word non-compliant produced the desired flinch. "Has the city approved your plan?" I asked. "It's a formality," she said too quickly. "We have a contractor on standby." "Your husband?" I shouldn't have said it, but we were done pretending. Her smile snapped like a purse clasp. "Conflict disclosures are filed," she said, brisk. "We follow process." Process. A lovely word when you want to rinse the blood from a decision. I took my leave with a polite nod, the wheels in my head turning a different kind of process, assembling itself, one shaped like filings and exhibits and subpoenas. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. A warning for Mom's bird feeder seed scatter attracts nuisance species. A citation for unsanctioned porch light color temperature. Too warm, apparently. The HOA preferred cool blue-toned compliance. Denise photographed our recycling bin because the lid didn't fully close. Pam emailed at 2:03 a.m. asking us to confirm receipt. They didn't want conformity. They wanted capitulation. Neighbors began stopping me on walks. "They told us to remove our swing," said a dad with sticky-fingered twins. Said it wasn't architecturally consistent. "They fined me for painting my front door. Sunset," said a woman across the cul-de-sac. "The approved orange is Harvest Moon." They are indistinguishable. Every story was a thread, and together they formed a rope pulling us all in the same direction out of patience. Did they realize what they were building? Not a parking lot. A coalition. Still, I tried one last olive branch, a letter formally worded politely, citing statutes and requesting reasonable accommodation for an elderly resident. I asked for a meeting with the full board and an independent mediator. The reply arrived in 24 hours. Request denied. Violations persist. Final notice attached. Attached was a notice of community improvement activities, a euphemism so bold it almost deserved applause. It listed dates for site preparation, grading, and asphalt pour, with our corner circled on the map in happy highlighter. The timeline began in 10 days. 10 days to erase a life. I read it twice, then a third time, eyes catching on the phrase, "pursuant to authorization." Authorization from whom? Not the city my contacts there would have called me. Not the county their permit tracker was a public database I knew like wallpaper. The authorization I suspected was a mirror, self-issued, self-justified, self-signed. That night, I walked the perimeter of Mom's lot, the grass cool and damp, the air, breathing out the last notes of summer. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table, polishing the brass numbers for the door out of habit, not yet admitting the door might not be there to receive them. "What will we do?" she asked, voice, steady eyes, bright, with a kind of stubborn hope that has guided me since childhood. "We will document everything I said. We will be patient until patience becomes complicity, and then we will be precise." I didn't tell her the precise shape of my plan, not yet. It would sound grandiose, a son swaggering when he should be comforting. So I made her tea, and we looked at old photo albums. The porch swing Dad hung with a level he didn't need. The garden party where Mrs. Patterson's hat flew off in a gust, and everyone laughed for a week. A blueprint of a life more beautiful than any HOA brochure. The machines hadn't arrived yet. The ground still held its own memory. But in the distance, I could hear the hum of inevitability, gathering like distant thunder rolling down Cottonwood Lane, looking for a place to park. You can always sense when trouble is circling. It doesn't announce itself with brass bands. It creeps in like mildew showing up in corners you didn't think to check. With the HOA, it started with cameras. One Saturday morning, while I was trimming hedges along Mom's driveway, I noticed Denise, the self-proclaimed queen of architectural review, lurking across the street. She held her phone high, snapping photos with the solemnity of a war correspondent. Click, step left, click, step right. Her ruler poked out of her tote bag like a rifle barrel ready for duty. "Morning, Denise," I called, wiping sweat from my forehead. Documenting, she replied like that single word was shield and sword all at once. "Non-compliant siding paint." "That paint is older than you," I said. "It's called patina." Her nose wrinkled. "It's called decay." She sent the photos straight to Victoria, no doubt, because by Monday, Mom received a letter. Unapproved paint discoloration. Immediate remediation required. It came stamped with the HOA's crimson logo, which looked more like a coat of arms than a community seal. Mom sat at the kitchen table with the letter, her hands trembling, teacup rattling against its saucer. "They make it sound like I'm poisoning the street," she whispered. I tried to calm her. "It's posturing, Mom. They can't knock down your house over a paint shade." But the letters kept coming. Every week, a new violation. Too many flower pots on the porch. Grass cut 3.25 inches instead of the regulation 3. The birdbath encouraged mosquito habitats. It was harassment disguised as bureaucracy, death by 1,000 fines. The neighbors noticed too. One evening, Mr. Hahn, who lived 2 doors down, knocked on our porch. He leaned on his cane and whispered, "They're circling you." Same thing happened to me when I refused to move my shed. They fined me until I gave up. I asked him, "What did you do?" "I sold," he said, simply, his eyes dull with defeat. "Couldn't fight them." That word "sold" clanged in my head like a warning bell. That's what the HOA wanted. Push people until selling feels like mercy, then swoop in with community development plans. I decided to confront them directly. At the next board inspection, I caught Victoria herself prowling along the property line with Todd in tow. Todd held a clipboard stacked with forms. Victoria wore her blazer-like armor chin, high lips pursed in permanent disapproval. "Lovely day to harass an old woman," I said, stepping into their line of sight. Victoria didn't flinch. "We're ensuring compliance." With what I asked. "Your parking lot fantasies." Her eyes flickered just for a second, but enough for me to know I'd struck the nerve. "We're improving the community," she said smoothly. "Your mother's property is an eyesore. It brings down everyone's value. Her roses win blue ribbons at the county fair," I shot back. "What value are we talking about? The kind you don't understand," Todd muttered, scribbling on his clipboard. Mom stood behind me on the porch, her voice quivering yet strong. "This is my home. My husband built it with his hands. You can't just erase that with paperwork." Victoria turned heels, clicking against the pavement like gavel strikes. "We'll see," she said. Cold, dismissive final. That night, Mom couldn't sleep. I found her at 2 a.m., sitting in the living room staring at the old grandfather clock. "They're going to take it," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I can feel it." I knelt beside her. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But deep down I felt it too, the inevitability pressing closer the way a storm front thickens the air before the first drop falls. 2 weeks later, the hammer fell. A certified letter arrived, thicker than the others. Inside, a notice of community reallocation, a polite euphemism for eviction. It cited multiple unremediated violations and declared the property condemned under HOA authority. At the bottom, a single chilling line. "Demolition scheduled, pending approval. Demolition." Mom read it 3 times, her eyes skimming over the words like they were in a foreign language. Then she clutched my arm. "They wouldn't dare." "They would," I said grimly. I drove straight to City Hall, stormed into the planning office, demanded to see the permits. The clerk, a kid with acne scars and an apologetic shrug, pulled up the file. Sure enough, a demolition permit had been approved. Forged signatures, rubber stamps from consultants, tied to Victoria's husband's construction firm. A closed loop of corruption, clean on paper, dirty as sin underneath. I photocopied everything. Evidence, ammunition. When I got home, Mom was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, digging frantically around her rose bushes. She pulled out mason jars, Dad's old coin collection hidden decades ago. Her hands shook as she thrust them into mine. "If they're going to bury me, at least let me save this." I wanted to cry, but instead I promised Mom, "They're not burying you. They're burying themselves." Still, the machinery of the HOA didn't stop. Trucks rolled into the neighborhood the next morning, engines growling, orange vests swarming like ants. Victoria stood at the edge of our driveway, barking orders into a walkie-talkie, clipboard in hand. She looked up at me with a smile so smug it made my fists ache. "Progress waits for no one," she said. "Neither does justice," I replied. My voice low enough only she heard. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "We'll see about that." The first bulldozer inched forward. Dust rose, engines roared, and with every metal claw that dug into the soil, my fury hardened into something sharp, unbreakable. They thought they were demolishing a house. They didn't realize they were building a case. And soon, very soon, they'd discover whose courtroom they were walking into. There are moments in life when time doesn't just slow down, it fractures. That morning, the sound of diesel engines rattled the air before the sun had fully risen. I thought at first it was roadwork down on the main highway, but then I saw the convoy of machines crawling down Cottonwood Lane like an invading army. 2 bulldozers, a backhoe, a dump truck, and a white pickup with the HOA logo slapped on it. Doors. By the time I ran out of the house, Mom was already outside in her nightgown, hair, undone slippers sinking into the damp grass. She clutched her Bible in one hand and her rosary beads in the other, trembling like the earth under those machines. "Stop!" I shouted, sprinting toward the lead bulldozer. The operator, a guy in mirrored sunglasses, just pointed toward Victoria, who stood at the curb with her ever-present clipboard. She raised her hand like a conductor at an orchestra and barked proceed. The blade lowered with a screech, biting into the soil along the front garden. The roses Mom had tended for 40 years, gone in seconds, churned into mud. Mom cried out a sound that cut sharper than any engine. Neighbors began to gather. Mr. Hahn shuffled up with his cane, his mouth gaping. The Patterson kids filmed on their phones. Even Denise Ruler, tucked under her arm, hovered nearby, documenting like this was some grand unveiling. I stepped in front of the dozer, my heart pounding. "You have no authority for this," Victoria smirked. "We have permits." She waved a paper in the air like a victory flag. "Forged permits," I snapped. "I've seen the files." Her smile faltered for only a breath. "Progress can't be stalled by sentimentality." "Sentimentality," I barked. "This is my mother's home. Her life, her history." She tilted her chin. "History doesn't pay dues. Parking lots do." That line, that single heartless line, burned itself into my memory, because at that moment the bulldozer lurched forward again. I barely had time to pull Mom back before the machine chewed into the porch. Wood-splintered nails shrieked the entire front steps, collapsed in a storm of dust. Mom screamed, "My photo albums." She tried to rush forward, but I caught her arm. "You'll get killed," I said, coughing in the rising cloud. I dashed inside the house, trembling around me, walls groaning as if they knew their end was near. I grabbed what I could, the albums, Dad's war medals, a quilt my grandmother stitched by hand. The floor shook, plaster rained from the ceiling, and I barely made it out before another machine clawed through the living room wall. The sight was biblical, dust rising like smoke, the roof sagging, decades of memories shredded into rubble while neighbors stood frozen. Some gasped, some filmed. Some even cheered quietly, those who bought into Victoria's modernization vision. Mom collapsed onto the grass, clutching her albums, sobbing into my chest. I held her tight, my own rage boiling so hot I thought it might scorch through my skin. "Stop this madness," I shouted again, my voice hoarse. "You'll regret this." Victoria stepped closer, heels, clicking face hard as stone. "We operate within our bylaws. You can take it up at the next meeting." A meeting, I spat. "You think minutes and motions can erase what you've just done?" Her eyes glittered. "You'll find fighting us is futile." And then she turned her back, dismissing me like a nuisance. That was her mistake. The machines worked for hours. By noon, the house was nothing more than a skeletal pile of wood, brick, and dust. Mom sat in silence, numb, while I guided her toward a neighbor's porch swing. Neighbors brought her water tissues, hushed condolences, but the damage was done. One by one, pieces of our history were loaded into dump trucks. The rocking chair where Dad used to read the paper splintered. The cedar chest holding wedding linens crushed. Even the bird bath smashed under a backhoe's tire. Each crunch was another nail in the coffin of my patience. When the machines finally rolled away, the lot looked like a battlefield. What once was home was now flattened dirt ready for asphalt. A crude wooden sign hammered into the ground read, "Future Parking Expansion, courtesy of Maple Creek HOA." Courtesy. The word made me laugh bitterly. Courtesy was dead on Cottonwood Lane. Mom whispered, "Where will I sleep tonight?" Her voice was small like a child's. "You'll sleep safe," I promised, though my throat was tight. "They may have torn down your house, but tomorrow we'll tear down theirs. Just not with bulldozers." Because here's the thing, Victoria didn't know the thing. None of them knew. I wasn't just a son watching his mother's house collapse. I was a judge, a man with access to the law, to the system they thought they could bend. They'd written me off as another powerless neighbor. But in 24 hours, the HOA's bulldozers would look like toys compared to the hammer I was about to drop. As the sun set over the rubble, painting the dirt red, I sat on the curb beside Mom. My shirt was stained with dust, my hands with splinters, my heart with fury. But underneath it all there was clarity. Tomorrow justice would arrive. Not with fists, not with machines, but with a gavel. When the last bulldozer coughed smoke and rumbled off cottonwood, lane silence fell like a funeral shroud. What used to be Mom's home, the heart of our family, was now a scar of dirt and broken brick. The air still smelled of diesel, acrid and heavy, and dust swirled in the fading sunlight like restless ghosts. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering, recording, shaking their heads. Some offered polite condolences. Others avoided our eyes, ashamed to have watched and done nothing. I walked into the ruins. My boots crunched over glass and plaster. The porch swing Dad once hung was splintered, one chain dangling from a lone support beam like a noose. The kitchen table was smashed into pieces, the checkered tablecloth buried in rubble. I bent down and lifted part of a broken photo frame. Behind the cracked glass was a picture of Mom and Dad on their wedding day, his army uniform crisp, her smile radiant. The frame cut my palm as I pulled it free, but I didn't flinch. Pain was nothing compared to what burned inside me. Mom sat on a folding chair someone had brought from their garage. She held her photo albums tight to her chest, rocking slightly. Her eyes weren't wet anymore. She'd cried herself dry. That scared me more than the tears. It was as though she'd aged 10 years in a single afternoon. I knelt in front of her. "We'll rebuild," I whispered. "We'll make them answer for this." Her lips trembled. "They said they'd send me a reimbursement check," she said bitterly. "As if money can replace memories. They won't get away with it," I told her. My voice carried more conviction than I actually felt in that moment. But saying it aloud, making the promise, anchored me. I spent the next hours salvaging what I could. Mom's cedar chest was crushed, but I managed to rescue a stack of quilts that only smelled faintly of smoke. Dad's war medals were dented but intact. The grandfather clock had shattered into pieces. I collected what I could into a box. Every item felt like a piece of evidence, not just memory. Evidence for the case that was rapidly assembling itself in my mind. Victoria and her cronies reappeared around sunset, clipboards in hand, strutting along the ruined lot like architects admiring their work. She had the audacity to wave at me. "Progress comes at a price," she called out, voice smug. "You'll thank us when you see the new parking spaces." My fists clenched so hard my knuckles cracked. But I didn't lunge at her. Not yet. I forced myself to stand still, silent, letting the fury simmer. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to break to give her more ammunition. Instead, I gave her nothing but a stare cold enough to freeze the smugness in her throat. She looked away first. That night, I stayed with Mom at a neighbor's spare room. She drifted into restless sleep, clutching her rosary. I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every smirk, every false permit. I wasn't just a son anymore. I was a strategist. And here's the truth. I hadn't shared with most neighbors. I wasn't simply a lawyer, though I'd practiced law for decades. I was a sitting judge in the county courthouse. I'd kept that low-key in the neighborhood. I wanted to live quietly, not parade around like royalty. But now that anonymity became my sharpest blade, I began drafting motions in my head, lining up statutes, envisioning subpoenas. Their permits wouldn't stand under scrutiny. Their kickbacks, their cozy contracts with Victoria's husband's firm, every dirty thread could be unraveled. They had paved over the wrong house. They had awakened the wrong man. The next morning I returned to the lot. Workers were already measuring, preparing to lay gravel. I snapped photos cataloging every step. One worker muttered under his breath, "This doesn't feel right," but still he followed orders. When Victoria showed up again, sipping iced coffee like she was on vacation, I stepped close enough for her to hear me without the crowd. "You should have stopped at letters," I said. She smirked. "You should have painted your shutters." "You don't realize what you've done," I told her. "Tomorrow you'll understand." Her eyes narrowed, but she laughed, brushing me off. She thought I was bluffing. I walked away then because words weren't enough anymore. Action was. Back at my office, I spread the documents across my desk, forged signatures, dubious approvals, financial ties between board members and construction firms. It was like connecting dots in a coloring book. Every line spelled corruption. I filed an emergency injunction, fast-tracked under judicial authority. Tomorrow at the courthouse, the HOA would face something they never expected: accountability. That night I told Mom. She sat at the kitchen table of our neighbor's house, staring into her tea. "I'm not powerless," I said. "You know what I do. Tomorrow they'll walk into my courtroom." Her eyes widened, then softened. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Your father would be proud," she whispered. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. That was enough fuel to carry me through the storm ahead. As I turned off the light and let her rest, I whispered a promise to the shadows. Tomorrow, the gavel will fall, and when it does, it won't just be wood striking wood, it will be justice striking down arrogance. The rubble outside was not an end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Most people in the neighborhood thought of me as the guy in the green truck. The one who mowed his own lawn, waved at kids on bikes, and occasionally grilled steaks out back with too much smoke. They knew I had some kind of law background, but none of them really grasped the truth. That was by design. I liked being the neighbor, not the robe. I wanted Mom to live quietly without people tiptoeing around her son, the judge. But the night after the demolition, as I stared at the mountain of evidence on my desk, it hit me, hiding behind that green truck persona was over. If Victoria and her cronies wanted to bulldoze us into submission, then it was time for me to bulldoze them with the law. I pulled out files from my cabinet. Not HOA newsletters, not polite correspondence, but state statutes, precedent cases, municipal codes. I'd handled eminent domain disputes, landlord-tenant battles, corporate fraud trials. This situation was a Frankenstein monster of all three, stitched together with arrogance, and I knew exactly which scalpels to use. The evidence was damning. The permits they waved around were signed by a supposed city inspector who, upon one quick phone call, admitted he hadn't set foot in Maple Creek in years. The contracts for demolition were awarded directly to Lang Construction, Victoria's husband's firm, without bids, without disclosure. The financials showed HOA funds being funneled into consultancy fees that just so happened to match deposits in board members' personal accounts. If corruption had a smell, it would have reeked like gasoline from those papers. I leaned back in my chair and smiled grimly. They thought they were untouchable because they wore blazers and held clipboards. But tomorrow, those same blazers would look more like straitjackets. The following morning, I dressed differently. Not in jeans and boots, but in my suit, dark gray, crisp tie, polished shoes. Mom raised an eyebrow when she saw me. "You're not going to the courthouse as a lawyer," she said slowly. "No," I told her. "I'm going as myself." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked 20 years younger. "You mean—" "Yes," I said. "They'll see who I am when they walk in." She smiled through her exhaustion. "Oh, they have no idea what's coming." Before heading out, I stopped at the ruins of her house. Workers were idle, confused by the sudden injunction I'd filed overnight. A yellow backhoe stood still, like a predator denied its prey. The crude future parking lot sign flapped in the wind, mocking me. I planted my feet in the dirt and said quietly, "This ground isn't yours. Not today. Not ever." At the courthouse, I walked through the marble halls with renewed purpose. Colleagues nodded as I passed. They'd heard whispers already, Maple Creek HOA demolition scandal expedited hearing. I could feel the weight of the system behind me, gears ready to turn. The bailiff handed me the docket. Case scheduled for 9 a.m. Judge, judge. The word carried a different resonance that day. Not just a title, but a promise. At 8:55, the HOA entourage shuffled in. Victoria led the pack red blazer, freshly pressed lips stretched into that familiar smirk. Todd clutched a briefcase stuffed with papers, while Denise carried, of course, her ruler, as if measuring court benches might somehow save her. Pam trailed behind, phone in hand, already drafting what I imagined would be a smug community update email. They looked around, expecting some friendly magistrate they could charm, maybe even a small-town judge. They could steamroll with procedural compliance. Then they saw me. Victoria froze mid-stride. The smirk died on her lips. Todd's briefcase slipped and hit the floor with a thud. Denise whispered something sharp, her ruler clattering to the ground. Pam gasped, "Oh my God," loud enough for the gallery to hear. I took my seat at the bench, gavel in hand. "Court is now in session," I said evenly, though inside I'll admit I savored their faces like fine wine. The room fell silent. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it was almost audible. These people who had strutted through Cottonwood Lane like emperors now sat small, brittle, suddenly very mortal. I opened the hearing by outlining the charges: unauthorized demolition, fraudulent permits, conflict of interest, abuse of HOA authority. Each word landed like a hammer on their carefully built facade. Victoria tried to recover. "Your Honor, surely there's been some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," I cut her off, my voice echoing. "You signed demolition orders without city approval. You funneled contracts to your husband's firm. You destroyed private property belonging to an elderly resident without due process. Which part is a misunderstanding?" She opened her mouth and closed it. No smirk this time, only silence. Todd fumbled through his briefcase, waving papers. We have documentation." "Indeed you do," I replied calmly. documentation that will serve as Exhibit A for the prosecution. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The neighbors who'd come to watch leaned forward, eyes wide. For years they'd felt bullied, intimidated, powerless, and now they watched the bullies tremble. Denise finally spoke, her voice thin. We were only following the bylaws. I leaned forward. Bending bylaws into weapons doesn't make you lawful, it makes you dangerous, and it makes you accountable. Pam muttered something about community spirit, but her voice cracked, betraying the fear underneath. As the morning wore on, the evidence piled higher. Each fraudulent signature, each shady contract, each intimidation email. The more I presented, the smaller they seemed. Victoria no longer looked like a queen in red. She looked like a cornered fox, darting her eyes trapped. By lunchtime, the gavel hadn't yet fallen, but everyone in that room knew how this story would end. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, I felt the weight in my chest lift. Justice wasn't just coming, it was already here. The air inside the courtroom was heavier than stone. Every cough, every shuffle of paper echoed off the high ceilings as though the building itself was holding its breath. Behind me, the gallery was packed. Neighbors from Cottonwood Lane had come in droves, some curious, some eager, some trembling with hope that maybe, just maybe, the bullies with clipboards were about to be unmasked. I sat high on the bench gavel, resting beneath my fingertips. From where I stood, the HOA board members looked like schoolchildren caught cheating on a test. Victoria, usually as immovable as a statue, twisted her bracelet around and around her once perfect smirk, curdling into a grimace. Todd hunched over his briefcase like it could shield him from the law. Denise gripped her infamous ruler so tightly I thought it might snap. Pam's phone trembled in her hands. She wasn't typing this into an email blast anymore. "Call the case," I instructed. The bailiff's voice rang out. "Maple Creek Homeowners Association versus Eleanor Whitaker." The name, my mother's name, hung in the air like a sacred bell. Mom sat in the front row, her hands folded over her rosary. She looked smaller than usual, her shoulders hunched, but her eyes burned steady. When she caught me glancing at her, she gave me the faintest nod. That was all I needed. I adjusted my glasses and looked squarely at the board. "You stand accused of unlawful demolition, fraudulent contracting, and abuse of fiduciary duty." Todd sprang to his feet first. "Objection," he squeaked. "To what?" I asked. To this entire process." His voice cracked. "We have authority under our bylaws." I raised a hand. "Authority does not supersede law, Mr. Perkins. Your bylaws are not a license to commit fraud." The gallery murmured. A few neighbors even clapped before the bailiff barked them into silence. Victoria finally rose, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Your Honor," she began, her voice wobbling between defiance and desperation, "everything we did was for the betterment of the community. We have long-term plans, visions, goals." I cut her off with one raised brow. "Did those plans include bulldozing an elderly woman's home without notice? Did they include funneling contracts to your husband's company without disclosure?" Her jaw tightened. "Those contracts were fair. We followed procedure." "Procedure is not a substitute for integrity," I snapped. My voice boomed harder than I intended, but I didn't regret it. "You can dress corruption in a blazer and call it policy, but it is still corruption." She faltered, searching for words. For the first time, the iron mask cracked. Next came witnesses. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson leaned heavily on her cane, but her voice cut clear. "They fined me for the ramp I needed after my hip surgery. Said it wasn't aesthetic. I had to beg my son to cover the penalties." A young father testified. "They told us to tear down our kid's swing set, called it a hazard." My wife cried for weeks. Even the demolition foreman reluctantly admitted we were told permits were in order, but something felt off. When I saw that old woman crying, I knew it wasn't right. Each testimony was another nail hammered into the HOA's coffin. I let them speak, let the gallery hear, let the truth breathe. Finally, I addressed the defendants directly. "This court has heard enough. You use the veil of community improvement to line your own pockets, to trample rights, to destroy lives. That is not governance. That is tyranny in miniature." Victoria's face flushed scarlet. "We were trying to raise property values," she shouted, the composure gone. I leaned forward, my gavel poised. "Property value is meaningless if it costs a community its soul." Silence slammed down. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. I glanced toward my mother. Her eyes glistened, but she sat proud, dignified, her hands no longer trembling. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was testimony enough. I turned back to the HOA board. Do you have anything further to say before this court issues its ruling? For a long moment, no one spoke. Todd swallowed hard. Denise's ruler slipped from her grip and clattered against the table. Pam wiped at her eyes. And Victoria, once the queen of Cottonwood Lane, stood there, trembling lips pressed shut, utterly out of words. That was answer enough. I lifted the gavel. Then this court will proceed. The sound of wood striking wood rang out like thunder, and the entire gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in the collective exhale of justice finally catching up with arrogance. Tomorrow I would hand down the official judgment. But in that moment they all knew. The HOA had already lost, and Cottonwood Lane was no longer theirs to rule. When the gavel's echo finally faded, I ordered the clerk to bring forward the evidence files. Thick binders landed on the bench with a weighty thud. The sound alone made Victoria flinch. This court will now examine the documents submitted, I announced, flipping open the first binder. Exhibit A, demolition permits allegedly authorized by City Inspector Leonard Brooks. The courtroom projector hummed to life, throwing the scanned documents onto the wall. I pointed to the signature. Problem is, Mr. Brooks retired in 2019. He testified in a sworn affidavit that he never signed these papers. In fact, he hasn't set foot in Maple Creek in 6 years. The gallery gasped. Mrs. Patterson muttered. Knew it under her breath. Todd shifted nervously, sweat shining on his forehead. Those must have been clerical errors. Clerical errors don't deposit $15,000 into your personal account 2 days after the contracts were awarded. I snapped the binder shut and moved to the next. Exhibit B was even worse. Bank statements neatly highlighted traced a bright yellow line from the HOA's Community Development Fund straight into Lang Construction's coffers, Victoria's husband's company. From there, money splintered into smaller deposits to the board members' private accounts. This is kickback, plain and simple, I said. You sold out your neighbors for parking spaces and personal profit. Denise's face drained of color. She stammered. We followed procurement policy. Policy does not excuse theft. I cut in my voice, ringing against the marble. Nor does it excuse deceit. The projector flashed again. Exhibit C, screenshots of emails. One from Victoria to the demolition foreman, reading, "Proceed immediately. If questioned, claim urgent safety hazard. HOA will handle the paperwork." The foreman called to the stand, confirmed it. She told us the structure was unsafe, ready to collapse. Said she'd take care of the permits. I believed her. Until I saw the old lady crying on the lawn. His voice cracked with guilt. The room buzzed with outrage. A neighbor from the back shouted shame, and the bailiff had to bark for order. I kept going. Exhibit D, minutes from a closed session HOA meeting where Victoria declared, "If the Whitakers won't move, we'll clear them out." The handwriting in the margin was unmistakably Todd's finally progress. Victoria tried to interject, her voice sharp. "Those notes are taken out of context." "Context," I thundered. "The only context here is greed and arrogance." I let the silence hang heavy, let them feel the full weight of their betrayal. Pam, pale as paper, finally broke. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just sent emails." "I didn't know they'd actually," she trailed off, wringing her hands, eyes darting toward Mom. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mom didn't respond, but her stare was steady, unflinching. She didn't need apologies. She needed accountability. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the bench. This court recognizes the Maple Creek HOA has acted outside its authority, forged government documents, misused community funds, and caused irreparable harm to residents. You thought you could disguise corruption with bureaucracy, but today the disguise has been stripped away. Victoria slammed her hands on the table, desperation breaking through. "You can't dissolve us. We are the HOA. We are the rules." Her voice cracked on that last word. The gallery erupted in gasps, then murmurs of disbelief. I fixed her with the coldest stare I could summon. "No, Mrs. Lang. You are not the rules. You are subject to the rules, just like every other citizen in this county. And the law does not bend to your parking lot fantasies." For the first time, I saw fear replace arrogance in her eyes. The clerk distributed printed summaries of the findings: fraud, forgery, conflict of interest, abuse of fiduciary duty. Each word landed like a hammer. The board members hunched lower in their chairs, as though trying to shrink themselves out of existence. One by one, neighbors stood in the gallery, emboldened by the truth. A father raised his hand and said, "They fined us $200 for chalk drawings on our driveway." A widow called out, "They threatened to tow my car because it had a scratch." Voices rose, each one a story of harassment, intimidation, humiliation. The courtroom became a choir of grievances. Decades of petty tyranny poured out at last. and the board sat there shrinking under the weight of their own legacy. I let the testimony flow. The law could handle the fraud, but this collective roar from the community was the real justice. Finally, I raised the gavel. The voices quieted, all eyes locked on me. This court will deliberate sentencing tomorrow, but make no mistake, the truth has been exposed. The Maple Creek HOA's reign of intimidation is finished. The gallery erupted in applause this time, and I did not silence them. They'd waited too long for this moment. Victoria slumped in her chair color, drained her clipboard hanging limp from her hand. The Queen of Cottonwood Lane had been dethroned. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, I saw my mother smile. Not a wide smile, but the quiet, kind, fragile, yet fierce the smile of someone who'd finally been heard. The battle wasn't over, but the war had already turned. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows like divine confirmation. The gallery filled again, neighbors, reporters, even a few city officials who suddenly wanted to see how deep this rot ran. The HOA board shuffled in like prisoners walking to the gallows. Gone were the blazers pressed to perfection. Today their collars sagged, their faces pale, their confidence obliterated. I took my place at the bench, gavel in hand. The room hushed instantly. "This court reconvenes for final judgment," I said, my voice steady but carrying the weight of everything we'd endured. The clerk read the charges. One last time: fraudulent permits, unlawful demolition, financial misconduct, abuse of fiduciary duty. Each phrase echoed like a drumbeat. Victoria winced at every syllable. Todd stared at his lap. Denise fiddled with her broken ruler. Pam dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Before this court issues sentencing, I said, "You may speak." For a moment, no one moved. Then Victoria rose, shoulders stiff. Her voice was low but defiant. "We tried to modernize this neighborhood. People resist change. Yes, mistakes were made, but progress requires sacrifice." I leaned forward. "Your so-called progress was theft. Your sacrifice was someone else's home. You do not get to bulldoze lives for convenience." The gallery murmured agreement, a low rumble of support. Todd cleared his throat, finally standing. I only signed what Victoria gave me. I didn't know it was illegal." "That excuse has echoed through history," I replied. "Complicity is not innocence." Denise stood next, trembling. "I just enforced the rules. Measurements, photos, I didn't think it would come to this." "You thought a ruler made you righteous," I said coldly, "but it made you cruel." Pam didn't rise. She just whispered, "I'm sorry," staring at her phone screen like it might swallow her whole. I nodded to the bailiff. "Thank you. That will be all." Then I delivered the ruling. "On the charge of fraudulent permits, this court finds you guilty. On the charge of unlawful demolition, guilty. On the charge of financial misconduct, guilty. On the charge of abuse of fiduciary duty, guilty." The words cracked through the air like lightning. The gallery erupted in gasps and cheers before I raised my hand for silence. As sentencing, I continued, "This court hereby fines the Maple Creek HOA $500,000 payable to the Residents' Restitution Fund. Lang Construction is barred from bidding on community projects for 10 years. Board members are removed from their positions effective immediately. Furthermore, Victoria Lang and Todd Perkins will be referred for criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. Denise Keller and Pamela Ross are placed under probationary review with mandatory community service." The bailiff stepped forward, taking Victoria and Todd by the arms. Victoria tried to twist free, shouting, "You can't do this. I am the HOA." I slammed the gavel. "You were the HOA. Now you are defendants." The room thundered with applause. Neighbors stood clapping, cheering, some even crying. Mrs. Patterson raised her cane like a victory flag. Children clapped their chalk-stained hands. For the first time in years, Cottonwood Lane felt united. I glanced at my mother. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped, tears running down her cheeks. But these were not tears of grief, they were tears of relief, of vindication. She mouthed, "Thank you." The bailiff led the disgraced board members out, their heads bowed. The Queen's crown had shattered, the treasurer's briefcase empty, the enforcers exposed. I raised my voice one last time. "This case is adjourned." The gavel fell, and the sound was not just wood on wood, it was justice, hammering arrogance into dust. Afterward, neighbors surrounded my mother, offering hugs, promising to help rebuild. Donations poured in before the day was out. A local news crew interviewed me on the courthouse steps. I gave them one line: this wasn't about parking spaces, this was about power. And today, power was returned to the people. That night, as we drove past the empty lot, Mom reached for my hand. The rubble was still there, but now it looked less like a grave and more like fertile soil, a place where something new could grow. She smiled softly. Your father would have loved this. He always said the law was our family's real inheritance. I squeezed her hand. We'll rebuild, Mom, but first we'll rest. Justice has been served. The headlights swept over the crooked sign that once declared future parking lot. It now leaned sideways, battered and pathetic. I laughed under my breath. That sign wasn't a promise anymore. It was a tombstone for the HOA's arrogance, and for the first time in weeks I slept peacefully. The morning after the judgment, Cottonwood Lane looked different. It wasn't the rubble lot or the crooked sign that had changed, it was the air. People walked with straighter backs, waved with freer hands, and for the first time in years you could hear laughter drifting across porches, without the shadow of a fine hovering over it. The tyrants had been dethroned, and the neighborhood felt it like the first breath after a storm. Mom and I returned to the lot together. She wore her sun hat, the one she used to tend roses in, though the roses themselves were gone. The earth was bare and raw, but when she crouched down, pressed her palm into the soil, she smiled. Still good ground, she whispered. Things can grow again. Neighbors soon gathered. The Patterson kids drew chalk hearts on the broken pavement. Mr. Hahn brought seedlings in plastic pots. Someone set up a folding table with lemonade and sandwiches. What had been a demolition site transformed almost instantly into a community gathering place. It was like everyone had been waiting for permission to stand together, and the court ruling finally gave it. Donations poured in. A GoFundMe started by one of the younger residents skyrocketed within days. Local veterans groups, hearing that a judge had defended his elderly mother, offered labor and supplies. Even the city council, embarrassed by their oversight, promised grants to rebuild. I stood in the middle of it all, humbled. For weeks I had carried the weight of fury and justice on my shoulders. Now that burden was dissolving into something lighter: gratitude. Victoria and Todd's names appeared in headlines for weeks. HOA leaders face fraud charges, the papers declared. The trial dates were set, and though I wouldn't preside over them personally, I knew the evidence was overwhelming. Their empire of intimidation had been built on sand, and the tide had finally come in. Denise and Pam, left behind, tried to blend back into anonymity. They picked up trash along the roadside in bright orange vests as part of their community service. Once feared, enforcers now reduced to picking cigarette butts out of the gutter. Mom moved into my house temporarily while plans for rebuilding began. I found her in my kitchen one morning humming as she polished the rescued brass numbers from her old door. We'll put these back up, she said firmly, on the new house. Same numbers, same spirit. I laughed. A phoenix with a fresh coat of paint. She winked. Just make sure it's the approved color, Judge. For the first time since the bulldozers roared, we both laughed without bitterness. Weeks turned into months, and the lot transformed. Neighbors volunteered weekends, hauling lumber, mixing, cement, planting flowers. Children painted rocks to line the garden beds. Mom's house rose again, not identical but stronger, modern, yet filled with touches of the past. The porch swing was rebuilt from salvaged wood. The birdbath was replaced with a sturdier one, inscribed by neighbors, "Justice lives here." On the day we moved her back, the whole street came. Someone grilled hot dogs, someone else played guitar. Mom cut a ribbon strung across the new front steps, and when she walked inside, tears ran freely down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of loss anymore, they were tears of return. I stood on the porch watching it all and realized something important. The HOA hadn't just destroyed a house, they had accidentally built a community. By trying to control everyone, they had pushed us together. By overplaying their hand, they had awakened a strength no fine or threat could smother. That evening, as twilight settled over Cottonwood Lane, I sat with Mom on the new porch swing. She rocked slowly, looking out at neighbors laughing in the yard. "You know," she said softly, "I thought when they tore it down it was the end of everything. But maybe it was just the beginning." I nodded. Sometimes justice doesn't just punish, it plants. We sat in silence for a while, the cicadas buzzing, the smell of grilled food lingering in the air. I knew tomorrow would bring more cases, more battles, more wrongs to right. But for that night it was enough. Because the house stood again. Because my mother was home. Because justice had spoken and the neighborhood had listened. And I promised myself if arrogance ever tried to bulldoze its way back onto Cottonwood Lane, it would find me waiting. Not just as a son, not just as a judge, but as proof that no gavel, no bulldozer, no boardroom ever truly outruns truth. The HOA thought they buried us under rubble, but they only planted the seeds of their own downfall. Stories like this aren't just about homes or even about HOAs, they're about power, and what happens when ordinary people forget that they're never powerless. My mother's house was destroyed, but what survived was stronger, dignity, resilience, and community. When people stand together and refuse to be intimidated, no bulldozer can level them. Maybe you've felt cornered by people who abused authority at work, in your neighborhood, or even in your own family. Remember this: the rules are never above justice, and those who weaponize them will always face a reckoning. So here's my lesson to you: don't be afraid to stand tall, even if you feel small. Truth has a way of growing louder when it's spoken firmly, and sometimes all it takes is one person daring to say enough to change everything. If you've ever faced down unfair power, share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you want more tales of justice served hot on a silver platter, don't forget to subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't just tell stories. We prove that in the end, arrogance always falls and resilience always rises.